And just a few other housekeeping logistics. We will ask that folks hold audio questions until invited to unmute at the break point. Some questions may be answered as the training is provided. And with that, I will turn it over to Christine Gamberg to begin the training presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Herman. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our second quarterly informational webinar for parents, guardians, and caregivers titled Understanding Special Education, the IEP Process, and the IEP Document. My name is Christine Gamberg, and I am the Education Support Manager here at Alta California Regional Center. My position at the Regional Center is a result of a Department of Developmental Services directive in 2022 for all 21 regional centers throughout the state. The directive was for a position titled IDEA Specialist or Individuals with Disabilities Education Act Specialist. Alta California Regional Center retitled the position to Education Support Manager to create more accessibility and a better understanding of my role for those who are unfamiliar with IDEA. One of my roles is to serve as a liaison between the regional center and local education agencies, special education, local plan areas, and also county offices of education in our 10 county catchment area, with specific areas of transition, such as Part C, also known as Early Intervention Services for Infants and Toddlers with Disabilities, to Part B, also known as Assistance for All Children with Disabilities in the district, as well as post-secondary transitions. My role also includes providing trainings for our service coordinators and parent workshops. I joined the Regional Center in March of 2022 as a service coordinator in one of our children's units and began my current role in January of 2023. Prior to joining the Regional Center, I was a special education teacher and program specialist for over 20 years for a local school district here in Sacramento County. And I'm also a mom to an amazing son who has autism and ADHD, and he's had an IEP since he was 3 years old. So I've sat in many different seats at the table during IEP meetings and understand the different perspectives. One of the most challenging, rewarding roles is definitely being a parent in those IEP meetings, even with all of my knowledge and experience. That piece, it gets emotional when it's our own child. So I understand that piece of it, and we're hopeful that you learn some valuable information that you can use during the special education journey for your child. And with that, I will turn it over to Tara Cawthon-Argrich, our special education specialist.
Good morning. I am Tara Cawthon-Argrich. I am the special education specialist with Alta. I've been with Alta since March of 2023. I began this role in December of 2023. My past experience, I've been in education for around 10 years or so. I've done pretty much all avenues. I've been a tutor, I have been an instructional assistant, and I've been a special education teacher. My role with Alta is consultative in nature. So I consult with parents, I consult with service coordinators, I assist with the trainings and all of that fun stuff.
Okay, so today we'll be breaking up the webinar into two parts. In part one, we'll be discussing the special education fundamentals that include the overview of IDEA, FAPE, assessment evaluation, IEP, LRE, all these acronyms that we will define later on in the slides, IEP and participation, and then procedural safeguards. In part two, we will apply the fundamentals by reviewing the IEP document, and we'll discuss the following pages of the IEP document, which is information eligibility, present levels, special factors, goals, the ITP, the offer of FAPE, which also includes services and educational setting, and then notes. So for part one, we're going to cover the special education fundamentals. starting with the overview of IDEA, which stands for the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And that is a federal law that mandates districts to provide free, appropriate public education to eligible children with disabilities. So IDEA has 4 parts. And if you notice, the part B is the one that is the bigger one. And that's what we'll be focusing mainly on today. That part B is the assistance for all children with disabilities. And that's for children ages 3 through 21. But if you see that California, for the Part B services, it's extended through age 22. So in different states in the United States, they may follow the federal guidelines, which would end the special education and related services at age 21. But here in California, under California Education Code, that is extended through age 22. So the subsequent slides in Part 1 will encompass the main principles of IDEA.
So what is special education? We're going to kind of cover that. So IDEA has 6 main principles that focus on identifying a student's eligibility through evaluation, finding a classroom environment in the least restrictive setting as close to general education as possible, developing an individualized plan with goals and services, including parents, students in that decision-making process, safeguarding parent rights to disagree and remain active in the IEP as an active participant, and providing a free, appropriate public education to all students. FAPE is very dependent on, FAPE demands that students receive free public education that is appropriate to meet their unique needs. And then we'll get a little more into FAPE here because it's something you're going to hear quite a bit in the IEP process. So FAPE stands for free. Districts are required to provide special education services at no cost to the student or family. Appropriate services are designed to meet the unique needs of that student with the disability as determined through evaluation, observations. Public schools are obligated to provide special education services to all students who reside within their district of residence. And education, students have the right to be appropriately challenged in their education with that individualized education program. The next area we're going to cover are related services. So related services are designed to help students access their learning or environment at school. In order to receive these services, students must be assessed and demonstrate deficits that impact their learning in an educational environment. It's important to note that medical services are quite different from educational services. Medical services have a different set of criteria than the educational. When we're looking at medical versus educational, medical may be looking more at, if we're looking like, say, at like disability, things like that, they may be looking more at like a DSM type of situation, where educational, again, they're really looking at, is there a deficit, and does that deficit act as a barrier for the student to achieve or participate in their education? Students who are under a 504 plan also qualify for related services. Not every related services, speech is a separate one because it is tied, and we will get into this a little later. It is tied to one of the categories of special education qualification. Here are a few examples of related services that students could receive. We have speech therapy, orientation and mobility for students who may be blind, behavioral services, adapted PE, physical therapy, occupational therapy, educationally related mental health services. And these are just a few. There are a broad range of services that are highly individualized depending on student needs.
Okay, so for assessment evaluation, I put both terms. Under California Education Code, it's referred to as assessment, but under IDEA, they refer to it as evaluation. Used interchangeably, and they essentially, for this purpose, they mean the same thing. So we use it interchangeably because of the federal piece, they refer to it as evaluation. So evaluations, they help determine if the student is eligible for special education services, and then what services are needed to provide access to the curriculum. And that's based on whether they meet eligibility criteria. And it's the eligibility piece, like Tara had said, it's different from medical eligibility. It's based on IDEA and the California Education Code criteria, rather than the medical or DSM-5, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual 5 criteria that is used by medical practitioners or the regional center. The No One assessment tool can be used to assess eligibility. So it's a multidisciplinary evaluation, and more than one assessment is administered in order to create a whole picture or profile of a student that includes the areas of strengths as well as areas of deficit or weaknesses. And then students must be assessed in all areas of suspected disability. For example, if a student is having difficulty with speech, then the speech pathologist would need to complete those assessments in that specific area using standardized assessments to determine whether a student meets that eligibility criteria under speech or language impairment. The assessment plan also outlines the areas that will be assessed, as well as the title of the examiner. So if the speech and language is going to be assessed, then that it would say speech and language and SLP. In some districts, they also provide the name of that speech language pathologist or the name of the assessor. Not all the districts do provide that specific name. And you would need to provide your written consent in order to have your child assessed to determine eligibility. Okay, so today we're going to focus on the special education assessment evaluation timeline when a parent or guardian submits that to the school site or the district when they provide a written request for assessments. And then within 15 days, the district has 15 calendar days to provide the parent with a prior written notice and assessment plan, or the district provides a prior written notice outlining the reason why they are denying that request for assessment. So if a parent requests an assessment and they have enough data to determine that it's not warranted, they would need to legally provide that prior written notice to the parent and explaining why they are denying that request for assessment. Okay, so the parent or guardian reviews and signs the assessment plan and returns it to that IEP team. The team uses the date the assessment plan was received. So if a parent signs and dates it and then turns it in 3 days later, that timeline starts when the assessment plan was received, and that's the compliance date. And within 60 calendar days, excluding school holidays exceeding 5 days. So during winter break, because it's longer than a week, that 5-day break. So spring break wouldn't count, Thanksgiving break wouldn't count. Winter break and summer break, they exceed more than 5 days. That's when there would be a break. The assessments will be completed and an initial IEP or the meeting to determine eligibility, if it's an additional assessments, will be held to determine eligibility. And then if the child is found eligible for special education, the IEP can only be implemented once the parent or guardian has reviewed and provided written consent to the district's offer of free appropriate public education. So you have time to review that document, but just know that the services cannot begin until that written consent is provided by signing that IEP. And so in order to submit written requests for assessment or evaluation, our suggestion is to address it to the director of special ed or principal of the school that your child is attending, or if they already have an IEP and you're requesting additional assessments, you may submit that to a program specialist or your child's case manager. If they have speech and language, you can return that to the speech and language therapist. It should always be in writing so that they can have that written submission of a request, and then that's when the 15-day timeline would start. And email is considered written request, and by that you have a timestamp in order to keep track of that. But if you do provide it in letter format, then I would keep a copy for your records and write down when you did submit that, if the date is different, when you submitted that letter requesting those assessments. So some options that you have for assessments if your child has been assessed and the district provides the results that you don't agree with, you have an option to request in writing an independent education evaluation, or IEE, and that's at the public expense. Just note that only one IEE each time the school conducts an evaluation is allowed, and also the district must be given the opportunity to assess prior to requesting an IEE. So if you wanted, I'll give you an example. If you wanted to see if your child qualified for speech and language, but you requested an IEE as an outside assessor, the district would deny that because they do have the right to be the first one to assess to determine eligibility. And then if you don't agree with those assessments, then you may request your independent education evaluation. The district must either provide an assessment plan or that prior written notice if they decide to deny it and state that they believe that their assessment is appropriate and providing the reasons why. The district may also provide, they do provide a list of assessors, but just know that you do not have to use those lists of assessors that the district provided you.
Like we mentioned earlier, we talked about different categories under IDEA. So there are a total of 13 categories students can qualify for special education services under. We have the 13 here. So they are autism, deafness, emotional disturbance, hearing impairment, intellectual disability, multiple disabilities, orthopedic impairment, other health impairment, specific learning disability, speech or language impairment, traumatic brain injury, visual impairment, including blindness, and established medical disability. So this one is only for kiddos who are 3 to 5 years old and is also under the California Educational Code. So it may not span across all of our 50 states. The important thing that we want to note is disability does not drive services. Students will be receiving their services or placement based on their needs. So again, like Christine was talking about with assessments, they're going to have a full battery of assessments. It'll be multiple assessments through different assessors that will demonstrate, okay, we have a deficit in this area and we are going to need specific services to help us be successful in accessing our education. And that leads us into the IEP. So let's say we go through that assessment process and we qualify for an IEP. So an individualized education plan is developed to provide students with goals, accommodations, related services, and special education services in a legally binding document detailing the district's delivery model. So what that means is essentially the IEP document is going to outline what the student's needs are. So who is the student and how did they learn best? And here are our goals because these are the areas of deficit. And this is how we are going to deliver our services. So they will have, and we will get into this as we go through the IEP document in part 2. But they will deliver specifically how many minutes, where it will be conducted, and then they'll have a note section being even more specific as to how the student will be accessing these services. The next area we're going to talk about is LRE, or least restrictive setting. So this is to the maximum extent appropriate. Students with disabilities are educated with students who do not have disabilities. So the least restrictive setting, and we have another slide that will kind of get into it as well, the least restrictive setting would be general education. So we are always looking to see, can this student be successful in a generalized setting? And if not, then what is the next step in that least restrictive setting? an IEP team will consider a more restrictive placement into specialized settings or even a non-public setting once sufficient data is gathered and presented and all supports have been exhausted in that least restrictive setting. And here is a continuum of least restrictive placements. So again, starting from the least restrictive, we have general education. And one moment, there we go. Least restrictive setting is decided as a team. So resources must be exhausted and data gathered in order to look at a more restricted setting for students. So again, we would start in that general education setting down here. We may start with general education with support. So it could be a push-in model where we might have a special education teacher pushing in to a general education class, or even maybe a service provider like speech pathology, occupational therapy, things of that nature. Or we're pulling kiddo out in order to receive specialized services or academic goal work and things like that. The more restrictive settings are going to be a special day class. And actually, I'm going to go back here. Sorry. So I want to talk about special day class. So special day class is a more restricted setting. It's a specialized setting for students with mild to moderate disabilities. And this is leveled. So you might see it labeled as a special day class or SDC or specialized academic instruction or SAI on the IEP document itself, or teachers may refer to it as either or. Again, it's important to note that a special education class is leveled, so we want to make sure we're placing students in the appropriate level that is going to help them be appropriately challenged with education. We have mild to moderate settings, which should be aligned to the state standards. They may not hit every single standard, but students should be exposed to all of the curriculum. We have moderate to severe, which may be more focused on life skills, maybe more behavior. We have more like maybe for autism specific classes where they might be self-contained. We have emotionally disturbed classes, or I think they've changed the language around what that one is. I can't remember what the new language is there, but I apologize. So that one might be more behavior aligned for the students. And then getting into the more restricted settings, we have non-public schools, and I'm going to start down here. I apologize, it's a little backwards. So non-public school is determined by an IEP team. So if we are talking about a non-public setting, that means we've exhausted everything within that public realm. We've tried the general education, we've tried general education with supports, we've tried those SDC classes, and they're just not able to support the student. So then we would have a conversation about moving to a more restrictive setting where either behaviors or different skills can be targeted to assist the student. Homeschooling does not need to be determined by an IEP team. This is parent choice. You may want to discuss it with the IEP team. It is pretty restrictive because we are removing students from their peers. So we are taking them from that school environment and moving them into the home. When we're moving into a homeschool type of situation, parents essentially are absolving districts of their responsibility in educating the student. The districts are still obligated to provide special education services through an individual service plan. The most restrictive and the rarest setting is residential facility, that is here at the top. We've gone through all of the lists. We've done a non-public, we've done the SDC class, we've done general education with supports, we've tried general education, and none of it is working for kiddo. In order to access this type of placement, we need to see that we are demonstrating specific behaviors across all settings. So we would be seeing the same behaviors at home, at school, in the community, and in those settings, we are unable to manage those particular behaviors. Again, this is a very rare setting. It does not happen very often. California has a limited number of residential schools. So a lot of the time, if we reach this point, we may be looking at out-of-state placement. One moment, my mouse doesn't want to move over. Here we go.
Okay, so next for procedural safeguards, also referred to as parents' rights. I'm going to go over those procedural safeguards. The first one is to participate in the IEP process. So your parents and guardians and students, if they are if it's appropriate for them to be at that IEP meeting. Typically, we see them joining around middle school. And also adult students who are 18 and not conserved, they would be the ones signing their IEP and part of that decision-making process. Have participate in the IEP process. They have a right to receive a prior written notice, also known as PWN, if the district refuses or proposes a change to request services or programs on the IEP. The consent or refuse consent for assessment and or services. They have the right to non-discriminatory assessments of the student. Independent education evaluations, which we discussed in a previous slide, if there's a disagreement with those assessment results. Access to educational records. So if a parent or guardian requests those educational records, the district has 5 days to provide those records. Okay, next, continued. To stay in the current program, if there's a disagreement about the placement, they refer that to as stay put. So a parent wouldn't sign the IEP if they're not in agreement with that placement. So they would continue that previously signed IEP. To be given a hearing regarding disagreements about the IEP, to receive mediation or file a complaint against your school district. They do have uniform complaint procedures with it in the California Department of Education website. To be informed of school discipline and alternative placement, and then to be informed of policies regarding children who attend private schools. So the procedural safeguards must be provided to parents and guardians and students when you request a copy. The first time your child is referred for a special education assessment, each time you are given an assessment plan to evaluate your child, upon the receipt or due process complaint in a school, and also when the decision is made to make a removal that constitutes a change of placement. Typically, though, best practice, schools will provide or at least offer the procedural safeguards even at annual IEP meetings, or if there's pretty much at every IEP meeting, you will notice that you will be offered your procedural safeguards. And if you have any questions, because some of it can be a little bit complex, feel free to ask questions if you don't understand your rights. I would definitely ask them to explain your rights to you. They are able to do so, and they will ask if you have any questions regarding your procedural safeguards. Okay, so who is on the IEP team? Of course, the parent and guardian, general education teacher. If the child is in a special day class or self-contained classroom, that teacher of record, the special education teacher, or service providers. Service providers can be speech language pathologists, occupational therapists, physical therapists, and even more than that. School district representative, which would be an administrator or somebody that the district designates to be their administrative designee, or a program specialist who is through the special education department. The assessor or assessors, whoever would be able to interpret those assessment results. So if they had any assessment, a member of that team would be there to explain those assessment results. And then other individuals with knowledge of the student and also the student when appropriate. As I mentioned before, I've typically seen students join their IEP meetings in middle school. My own son, he started attending his IEP meetings in 8th grade. And some start as early as 7th grade. I've even seen 6th graders join, but it's up to at the discretion of the parent, whether you feel comfortable. There are some sensitive topics that are explained there. So they can also join in partial of that IEP meeting. Also, your service coordinator can help if you'd like to have support from the regional center. I would recommend providing your assigned service coordinator with adequate time in order to be able to attend if you feel that you need some support at those IEP meetings. Okay, so questions for part one before there was a lot of information.
It
So
was a lot.
oh,
Any questions around the fundamentals of the IEP?
and please, if you do have questions, please feel free. We added extra cushion on this webinar specifically for questions. So the actual presentation won't be the entire 2 hours. We added plenty of cushion for questions, if there are any.
And feel free to type them in the chat as we're going. We'll do our best to answer them as we go. And if we don't get them as we go, we can do it at the end as well. What does not working be? What does a not work? Sorry, it's early. What does a not working behavior look like in a traditional push and pull out environment? I would say if
that would be by data. That's hard to. It would be
hard.
a case by case basis based on data.
I would say if a student is in a particular setting and we're seeing an escalation in behavior, how often are they being removed from the class? How long are they removed from the class? Is it impeding their self and others in learning? We would have to, again, so anytime we're looking at maybe moving to a more restricted setting, we need a lot of data to support that move because we are taking them from a very broad, where we are with our typically developing peers who do not have disabilities, and putting them into a more restricted setting. So again, when we're doing that, so the reason for the data is there's always a caveat. There will always be some harm. So when we are talking about moving to a restricted setting, we need to talk about benefit versus harm. Does this benefit outweigh any harm that particular student would experience in moving to a more restricted setting? I hope that answers, but really we would see data. I would say teacher would definitely notice this if student is not in class often, or we're just having a lot of behaviors in that push in pull out model. That's
an inability to access that education program. That's the overall. Are they able to access that education program based on the data? Everything's data.
Yeah, anything in an IEP should be data driven. Alrighty, we're going to go ahead and move into part two. And
Okay.
part two is how do we apply these fundamentals to that IEP document?
Okay, so the first is, let me click off here. Okay. Is information eligibility. This form that we're showing here is more of a generic form that just shows the layout and contents. And those contents include the demographic information, which includes parents or guardians' contact information, the student's age, grade, gender, native language. Also, there are key dates related to that IEP, including the date of the IEP meeting, the date of the last evaluation, and the date of the next evaluation. So every 3 years, students must be reassessed to determine if they are still eligible. The IEP will also show the purpose of the meeting. So whether it's an initial IEP, whether it's a plan review, that some districts call it an annual, some call it a plan review, or reevaluation, reassessment, or triennial. That the reevaluation is that every 3 years. There's also a spot for additional purpose. Is it for a child in high school? So they would not only talk about that, whether it's an initial or a plan review or reevaluation, but they would also be discussing transition. So we'll be going over the ITP, which is the transition plan for students 16 and over. They'll also be able to mark that additional purpose for an IEP. Is it an interim meeting, which means a student who moves from one district to another and who has an IEP within 30 days, they need to hold that interim IEP to discuss those previous services and then put that on their new district form and determine whether those services in that delivery type will continue. Also, the disability, they do have the primary and secondary disability options there. And then how the disability affects the student's educational performance. So right here, like I said, this is more of a generic form where you can see all of the disabilities laid out. And typically what we see will show the next form for the subsequent slides and the present levels and everything. But this we used so that you can see all of those disabilities. Typically, we're not going to see all of the disabilities laid out like this. We'll have the identified primary and the identified secondary disabilities. So the recommended takeaway from this slide is to know the student's date of the IEP, the date of the last evaluation, what type of meeting was it, and then what are the disabilities. So what is the primary disability? And if they do have the option for a secondary, sometimes it'll say none, but what are those identified disabilities within the IEP? Okay, and here we have the next page, which is present levels of academic achievement and functional performance. You'll also hear it being referred to as present levels or present levels of performance. And this gives the team the opportunity to tell a story of where the student is performing in specific areas. So the first area we'll see is student preferences, the strengths, preferences, and interests. And this is where you talk about what their hobbies are, what they do well at, what they enjoy. This is where the service providers will provide their input. Also, the parents will provide input. What do you see as their strengths? And it doesn't necessarily have to be academically based. It can be all of the above. So hobbies, do they have strengths in reading? So that would go in that area right there. The next area we have are parent concerns, and this is related to educational progress. So what is the parent concerned with in terms of where their child is performing educationally? And if you see here, it says Mr. Doe has expressed concern with Janie's inability to form connections with peers. He also expressed concerns with Janie's struggle this is really small print, to regulate her emotions when faced with a new routine or non-preferred task. So this is where those parent concerns would go. This is not where any service providers or teachers would place the concerns. It's only for those parent concerns related to their child's educational progress. Next, we have the statewide or standardized assessments or test scores. These standardized assessments they start in third grade. So they do have the option it's a smarter balanced assessment or SBAC. And those are starting in third grade for English language arts and math. And there's also an option for students who have more moderate to significant level of needs. They are able to take that alternate assessment. Okay, so the next slide is where they're telling the story with all of those areas of education. So the first one is pre-academic, academic, or functional skills. Like Tara had stated, that there are some special day classes that they focus more not necessarily grade level standards, but they do a lot of those functional skills, and that those would be reported there as well. So this is where you would put a lot of data. I've also seen teacher concerns in this area in terms of how they're accessing the academic piece, English language arts, math, science, and then provide data, not just they're doing well in English. That mostly it needs to have data to tell a story about where they are performing in terms of academics or what they're able to do in that academic piece. The next is communication development, and this area will show how they communicate. That can include how they articulate. Are they able to express their thoughts and ideas? And then if the student does receive speech or language services, the speech language pathologist would put in information and data into this section. But if not, if they don't receive speech and language, they still need to document how the student is performing in relation to communication and the ability to understand and to express their thoughts and ideas. And the next is gross and fine motor. This is regarding fine motor skills and gross motor skills. If they're not receiving any type of related services in that area, they would note that they are able to write using a pencil, and their handwriting is legible. They have correct spacing, things like that. Gross motor skills, are they able to navigate their way in terms of walking, running, have what their gait is like in terms of gross motor skills? Can they climb? They may mention, can they climb on the playground? But if they are, also, are they able to perform in PE? PE starts in first grade for students. So are they able to participate in that PE program? If they are receiving related services in terms of those like adaptive PE or occupational therapy, physical therapy, those service providers would put that information in there in that section as well, where they would put data and how they're performing or how they're meeting their goals, basically everything that they're able to do in those gross or fine motor areas. The next is social, emotional, behavioral. This is where they would input information related to classroom behavior or playground behavior. How are they able to interact with peers? How are they able to interact with adults? How they emotionally regulate, whether they follow the school rules, any type of disciplinary actions that may have been taken. Also, if they have a behavior intervention plan, or educationally related mental health services or ERM services, which is a related service for students who require additional support in terms of social, emotional, and behavioral within the school setting. And next is vocational, and depending on the age of the student, they may document their level of independence, what their future plans are if they're older students, and what their areas of interests are. Okay, next is adaptive daily living skills. This area is a statement whether they're able to independently meet their needs or at what level are they able to meet their needs in the school environment. Are they able to use the restroom by themselves or do they need support? How do they navigate getting their lunch? If they bring their lunch, are they able to open all the packages? Also, parents can also input some of the information that they see, that homeschool connection that can also go in that area as well. And next, health. So this is information such as any type of medical diagnoses, any medication that is taken, If it's an initial or a reevaluation or triennial, the school nurse would put that information in terms of vision and hearing and any type of new information. If it's a reevaluation, any new information that has changed since that prior evaluation. And then the last one is areas for proposed goals. And these are based on the present levels. The goals are proposed in the areas of concern. So if they have the areas of concern are reading comprehension, writing conventions, math, behavior, and speech and language, goals in those areas would be developed in order to be worked on in their special ed services or programs. So one takeaway for parents who have kids here at the regional center, you be able to kind of compare you can even discuss it during an IPP. You may be able to address some of those areas of need outside of school, and then recommend some regional center services. If the service coordinator goes, that's a perfect way to collaborate with the school team to determine what the school is able to do to address those areas of concern, and then possibly what the regional center can provide in terms of some of those areas of concern that affect them more outside of the school setting.
The next area we're going to discuss on the IEP is the special factors page. So this page is to consider any additional factors that impact learning, particularly around maybe assistive technologies like an AAC, augmentative assisted communication device. That one always gets me. So if they need a talker to help them with, verbalizing things at school, any visual impairments that we might have, if deaf of hard of hearing, English language learners, maybe behaviors might be up in this area as well. They'll talk about English language development. So first and foremost, let me kind of pause there. It'll say up here at the very top, so does the student need assistive technology? Yes or no? This particular student does not require assistive technology. They are able to verbalize. They do not have an impairment, and we can kind of see that here. Does the student require low incident services? That is, again, around deaf, hard of hearing. And then they lay it out. So consideration. So if we are maybe visually impaired or hard of hearing, that would be here. This, again, particular student does not have those deficits. So we are saying, no, she does not have any visual impairments. She is not deaf or hard of hearing. The next section is around English language learning. So if English is not our first language, we need to specify where we are in our English language learning journey. There are different things that we do in order to help students access or learn English language. So they will, again, specify this particular student is not an English language learner, so this area has been left blank. But if they were an English language learner, we would see these sections filled out. How are they receiving their support? Is it through a structured English language immersion class, or is there an other multilingual acquisition program that we're utilizing? Are they receiving it in a general education setting, or are they receiving it in a special education setting? The next area is around behavior. So does this particular student have behaviors? Yes or no? If they do, we want to make sure we are outlining what the specific behaviors are and how we are currently supporting that behavior. So this particular student, we see their significant concerns expressed across the home and school setting. So we're seeing these behaviors at home and school in the areas including coping skills and self-regulation. And then we have, how are we supporting this particular student at school? So we have daily behavior progress report with fixed ratio of reinforcement for displaying desired classroom behavior. So that means we're giving them a continual reinforcer. So maybe some type of token economy, some type of verbal praise, whatever works best for this particular student. We have variable and intermittent reinforcement so that we are kind of switching it up as well. So we're being consistent in giving these particular reinforcers, and then we're switching it up a little bit as we're going through the day. We have direction instruction in social emotional coping skills and modeling and practice. So we are showing this particular student how they can cope, and we are assisting them in identifying those coping strategies. And then underneath that, we are going to have, does this particular student have a goal attached to their behaviors, and do they have a behavior intervention plan? So this particular student, you can see that it is checked off. They do have behavior goals and a behavior plan. If we have any goals around, or I'm sorry, if we have any behaviors that are impacting our learning, then we should have a goal attached. Goal is always our starting point. If we are still seeing behaviors, even as we're using these strategies, we have the behavior goal, then we would move into that behavior intervention plan. The next area is statewide assessment. So this will focus on identifying the appropriate statewide assessment for the particular student. So you can see at the top here, we have our CASP. So this is a standard one that all students take. They will be taking this again. It starts in 3rd grade. And you'll see it kind of varies. So for English language arts and for math, we are going to start in 3rd grade. We're going to go all the way to 8th grade. And we will take it again in 11th grade. And in these areas, we want to make sure we are outlining any supports that the students are going to need in taking this particular test. And these assessments, I want to preface, any supports we have here are not necessarily supports that they will be receiving in their classrooms. So we want to make sure we have supports here, and then we'll talk about later in the accommodation section, we want to make sure we have them in both sections, because just because it's here doesn't necessarily mean it's being taken into consideration in the class setting. So this particular student has text-to-speech items for language arts. They have noise buffers, so that could be headphones. They have a separate setting, so they would be in a smaller setting with less students. They also have access to simplified test directions. So with the simplified test directions, it's a script given to the teachers. So we have a long drawn out one for kiddos who do not need that particular accommodation. And then we have a more simplified version for students who might be in that separate setting to help them understand how they will be taking these assessments. For science, we see right down here, it doesn't start until 5th grade. So we do this in 5th grade, 8th grade, and high school. We also will be taking a physical fitness standardized state test. This is for 5th, 7th, and 9th grade. And again, in this area, we want to outline any accommodations that the student may need or any modifications they may need in participating in this standardized test. The other area we want to talk about here is the DRDP, which is the Desired Results Development Profile. This is for preschoolers. It is administered in natural settings, so they would see them like in the classroom. They would do this through like work samples, observation, ongoing documentation of the student. And our next area here. Oh, actually, I don't think I outlined it. But the next area we would talk about is the alternative assessment. So this section right here. So let's say we are unable to participate in the CASP testing, which again is that standardized test for all students. They are unable to partake in that. There is another one called the CAW, the California Alternate Assessment. So for this particular one, we would have it marked here. We would say that this particular student is participating in that alternative assessment. So it's still a standardized state test, but it's pared down more to the particular student's ability level, because we don't want to overly frustrate them with, let's say, like curriculum that they wouldn't necessarily be exposed to if they are in that more like moderate to severe setting where we're maybe focused more on fundamentals of say math or reading, any of those areas, or our ADLs. The other area on the statewide assessment will outline for English Language Proficiency Assessment of California, or the LPAC. So this again is for English language learners. It's going to, again, outline any type of accommodations that we may need, around the assessments, and they'll talk about our initial, so that first LPAC that we're taking. Are we going to take it with support? Do we need a separate setting? There's different accommodations for this test. And I do want to preface, all tests now are pretty much online. So this will be built into the state system when the student is partaking in these tests. And then it'll talk about summative, the domain exception. They'll talk about where they're at in all of these particular areas. LPAC it's kind of complex. For students who have disabilities, it can be very challenging because it may not be that we are less proficient in English, but more we have a deficit in terms of how we are understanding language. So it might be more that our disability is impacting our access to education, our access to the English language, rather than English being our second language. The next area we're going to talk about are goals in the IEP. This is probably one of the most important parts of the IEP. All of it is important, but this is what our student is going to be working on. So the first thing we want to do is identify the area of need. So this particular student's area of need is reading, and specifically the skill that we're focusing on is comprehension. We need to have a baseline. So the baseline is our starting point. What is our data around this particular area of comprehension? So for Janie Doe here, we see that when given a fourth grade reading passage and discussion, she's able to answer comprehensive questions with 80% accuracy. She is currently able to read a fifth grade passage and answer comprehensive questions with 50% accuracy. And then this particular student even had it broken down more. So expository. So expository is very easy, like black, white to find. We can pull specific information out of the text to answer the questions. And inferential is more of that gray area where we might have to read between the lines to identify like maybe a theme or something to that effect. So once we've established our baseline, our starting point, so we know this particular student is able to read at a fifth grade passage with 50% accuracy, we're going to have a goal from that particular baseline. So they should be connected. Anytime we see a baseline, it should be directly connected to a goal. And when we're writing the goal, we want to make sure that it is SMART. So SMART stands for specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time bound. So looking at this particular goal here, we have our time frame. So by 6/29/2025, after reading a fifth grade passage and class discussion, Janie will answer inferential because we know that that's her big area of need. She was able to answer 0 of 4. Answer inferential questions with 75% accuracy. So there we are very specific. We are measuring out. So we're starting at 0% and we want to get up to 75% in 3 out of 4 trials. It's important to have those trials because we want to demonstrate mastery. If we just say, oh, they're going to be reading at 75% accuracy, that means they might only have to do it one time. So we do want trials to make sure that they are actually demonstrating mastery and it wasn't just a one-off situation. And then this one even adds a little bit more with no more than one prompt, verbal or visual, as measured by teacher collected data and or student work samples. So we can see that whole SMART acronym, it's specific. We know exactly what we're going to be measuring. This should be achievable for a student. We're talking about a full year span of working on reading comprehension, inferential thinking, and understanding. And it's very relevant to her need and it's time bound. The next thing we're going to look at in terms of the goal is looking at the state standard. So every goal should be tied to either a state standard, English language learning, or an additional need for the student. So it'll be marked. So this particular student, we have this goal based on the California State Standard of English Language Literacy, I apologize, for reading literature. And then this is for grade 7.1. even though the goal is written at a 5th grade level, which is where this particular student is functioning, they are in 7th grade. So we are aligning the goal to the grade level they are in. We are just paring it down to make it accessible for them. We also want to know who is monitoring the particular goal. Typically, we're going to see it as the special education teacher or case manager. If it is a goal around, say, a related service like speech, it would be the speech language pathologist. Ooh, one sec, I wanted to talk about, I didn't have a box for that. I apologize. The next area here is our short-term objectives. So this particular section isn't always required. When I was an educator, I didn't fill out this goal. I taught older grades, so we didn't necessarily connect the goals to these short-term objectives. But we can see here, this is essentially a roadmap of where we expect student to be at particular points in the year. So by October of 2024, she's going to go from 0 to 25% in answering questions. By January 2025, she's going to be at that 50% accuracy. And then by April of 2025, she should be up to that 75% accuracy. So that's how we are predicting her progress to go.
Tara, it's required in those mod severe settings.
Oh, okay. I taught mild to moderate, so
Right.
I did
I
not
mean,
have to
there are
utilize
some
these.
districts that use it as best practice to use short-term objectives, but even if they're not obligated, but in those mod severe settings is where they're.
I see it a lot for elementary school kiddos as well.
Mm-hmm.
Our next one is that ITP or individual transition plan. So this is for students once they reach age 16, so 16 and up. This is the point where we want our student to pretty much be involved in their IEP. So even if they're not involved in all the other areas that we discussed, like the present levels, the goal section, we do want them to be present for this particular part of the IEP because this is particularly pertaining to them and their goals after high school. So we can see up here the course of study. We're going to lay out where they are, what have they taken so far. We could see this. And the IEP, I want to preface, was written for a 12th grader. So this would be if she was a little older. So again, this is for age 16 and up. But we see they've taken 10th grade, world history. We have English 10, VAPA, PE, health, electives, so on and so forth. And then we have for 11th grade, and then we're predicting for 12th. We'll have the units or credits that they have currently completed, how many are pending in terms of reaching that diploma. We're going to specify where these particular courses are leading. Are they leading us to a certificate of completion, or will they be leading us towards the diploma? And then we have our anticipated date of completion. We also want to make sure we're outlining conservatorship. So this is something to think about for our older students. So I would recommend start thinking about this around maybe even starting high school. You know, is our student going to need that support through the IEP process? If a student is not conserved, or if we do not have, say, power of attorney, student will be able to make their own educational decisions. And not every student is ready to take that on. And I want to preface, this is once they reach 18. So once they reach 18, they will have the say in their IEP and they will be required to be a part of the IEP because it is about them and they are the ones that hold all of the rights in terms of consenting. So it's important to think about power of attorney where you can help make those educational decisions for them once they reach that age of 18, or if they may need a more restrictive type of support in that conservatorship setting. And again, we're going to talk about age of majority, when they're going to be reaching that 18th birthday. And then our next one, appropriate measurable goals for the student. So is there an appropriate measurable post-secondary goal? Yes, we should have goals for after high school and where a student plans to move into. Or again, if you hold that power of attorney or conservatorship where you would like them to go based on their needs and their interests. We'll have about transition services and then annual goals that are related to transition on the IEP. The other section will outline how the student has participated in this. So were they invited? They should be invited to these particular IEPs because again, this is very much in relation to what they want after high school and how they participated in the meeting. So for this particular student, we have age-appropriate transition assessments and instruments, and then we're going to describe what those assessments were. So for Janie, she completed career inventories to help her identify what she would like to do after school. And then we will have our post-secondary goals. So there are 2 required goals. The first one is around training and or education. So for this particular student, they would like to enroll in a community college or a training program to pursue their post-secondary interest. And then we're going to have the standards that it's aligned to, activities to support this particular goal, and then the person who is responsible. So again, this will be staff, and for this one will be student as well. The next one will be around employment. So for this particular student, she would like to obtain a part-time job or full-time job related to interests. And again, we're going to be breaking it down. How are we going to be doing this? What standard is it tied to? The third one is optional. You may not see this at every ITP or individual transition plan. This is where we're planning on living after school. So if they're planning on staying home, we may have a goal of, us living in the home. If we're planning on maybe going to college, we want to live in a dorm, or we want to move in with a friend, or whatever that might be, we would outline it here.
Okay. Okay, next is the offer of FAPE. This is the first offer of FAPE. The next one would be educational setting. So this offer of FAPE service or free appropriate public education. And again, the entire IEP document is very important, but this is where the district is going to document any service options that have been offered and what services they'll be receiving based on those goals. So remember, the goals drive the placement and services. So this is where the districts offer, I'll read, I had to put my glasses on for this. So if you see, it says the service options that were considered by the IEP team. So they have to consider all options and go through the continuum of services to determine what the district's offer of FAPE is for that least restrictive environment. And if you see, Janie, the team discussed general education class without support, general education class with aid support, specialized academic instruction, and specialized academic instruction for part of the day. Now, in determining the least restrictive environment, they do need to consider any potential harmful effects on that child when they're spending their time outside of the general education classroom. So do the benefits outweigh the risks of not being in general education environment full-time with their typically developing peers? And here it states limited access to typically developing peers in classroom environment and less exposure to generalized curriculum. So that is the potential harmful effects of being outside of the classroom. And when they do make that determination for what the child needs based on the goals, then they will have determined that the benefits do outweigh the potential risks of being outside of that general education environment. The next area is any type of supplementary aid, so any accommodations that a student may need while they're in that education setting. If you can see here, the accommodations listed here for Janie are access to word processor for assignments longer than 5 sentences, and they do enter that start date and end date according to where the services are as well. So for the entirety of the IEP, those accommodations, the dates will match on the accommodations, as well as the next page where we're going to go over those services. Also accommodations here, check for understanding, allow processing time for response, front load changes in routines and classroom expectations, additional time on assignments up to 1 week, access to calculator for math and science when computation is not being assessed. So that would still be considered an accommodation rather than a modification. And then, I'm sorry, my computer's going crazy right now. One sec. It's not allowing me to see. And then, okay, next slide, please, because oh, okay, there we go. And then the next offer of FAPE is where they do document whether they will receive special education transportation. So for the determination of that transportation piece, if the student is in a special day class or self-contained class and a district places a child that is not at their school of residence, then they're obligated to provide or offer that transportation piece. Other times a district would provide transportation is on a case-by-case basis, and that would be determined within the IEP team. Next is the special education and related services. So this is where, based on the discussion about what the least restrictive environment, this is where they will document that with specifics. So they would state the service, which in this case is specialized academic instruction. They also refer to it as SAI. They have the start and end date. So the start date would also match those in the previous slide for the accommodations in the entirety of that IEP. So the start date would be June 30th, 2023, and the end date would be 1 full year from then. Who the provider is it the district, some or SELPA? They also do contract with non-public agencies. So that's where that would be listed there under provider. Is the service being delivered individually or as a group? Also, frequency and duration. So how often is that service being delivered and for how long and what location? So in this case, 3 times daily and 45 minutes each session in a separate setting. So in this case, this service for specialized academic instruction, and if you look down at the comments, it says it's for ELA, which is English Language Arts, math and science at 135 minutes daily. So that the way that that is written, that would be considered a pull-out program because it says location is separate setting. The next service underneath that specialized academic instruction is speech and language. And of course, the start and end date, the district is providing that service. And then it can be provided individual and group. Actually, now they like to break that into pieces because sometimes a child may say they have two speech and language sessions a week or 50 sessions a year for 30 minutes. And one is direct services one-on-one. So that would be individual. So there would be a second piece as well. If it's both group and individual, it would be broken down into 2. So right here, it's shown in 1 box, but traditionally it would be in 2 boxes, and say the second session in that week is provided whole class, because if they're in a self-contained class, then a lot of times a speech and language pathologist will push in to that classroom, and that would be considered a group setting. And as you can see, frequency 2 times weekly, duration 30 minutes. 1 is a separate setting. And then, of course, there would be a second box for speech and language, which would be group. We typically see speech and language. A lot of the related services will be documented in sessions yearly. So in that case, it's for related services. If if a session is missed, then they can make sure that within that year-long IEP, that those services have been given with as many sessions. I'll give you an example. So the frequency, 50 sessions, and duration is 30 minutes. So within that IEP year, those services would need to be provided 50 sessions before the next IEP. And Also extended school year. Students may qualify for extended school year, or also called ESY, if it's been determined that they exhibit regression of skills during extended school break. So during that summer break, if they have data, if the team has data to show that during extended school breaks, the student has shown a regression of skills, then they would qualify for that extended school year. It's typically 4 weeks during the summer, shorter length than a regular school day. And here it's listed on the same page as Offer FAPE. I have seen some districts have a separate ESY page, but that's determined whether or not they purchase that particular feature of the online system. So, but it's automatically given if they haven't purchased that piece on this Offer of FAPE page. As you can see, the specialized academic instruction, and then they give the start and end date. Like I said, it's typically 4 weeks. The district is providing that, and it's in a group setting. It's a self-contained classroom in that group setting for 240 minutes daily during that time period that the district establishes their ESY time. Sometimes, not always, if they do have speech and language and OT during the school year, but say they do not show any type of regression in like speech and language skills or their bilateral coordination, if they receive OT, they may or may not require speech and language and OT services during ESY. It's a case-by-case basis. Some students only require that academic piece in terms of the specialized academic instruction. And then some students, of course, need all of the services that they have been receiving during the regular school year. And it's just based on that data that's been collected, whether they do show that they have that regression of skills with those extended school breaks.
The next one we are going to discuss is offer of FAPE educational setting. So this is going to break down the educational setting where FAPE will be provided, so that free appropriate public education. So we should see the name of the district and the school of attendance. So pay close attention here, as the school of attendance may be different from the school of residence. So residence means that's where we're living. So technically we would want to go to, we always want to look at the school of residence first, but not every school of residence will have a full continuum of special education services. So we may need to look outside of our neighborhood school into a school that may be a little bit further away. So this will specify, what is our school of attendance versus our school of residence. So we see here for Janie, she is in district ABC Unified. Her school of attendance is ABC Middle. It'll also discuss our next one here. I talked about that. The location where the student receives the majority of their education, is it the same as above or is it different? So we have same as above for this student. Program setting, this one's an important one. So this is going to talk about how much time we're spending in a generalized general education setting versus a specialized setting or a separate setting. So for this particular student, we see that she is participating 75% of the time outside of the regular class and extracurricular non-academic activity setting. So that would be for things like her speech therapy and for her specialized academic instructions for language arts, math, and for science. So we see she's spending 75% of her day outside of general education, and then we have 30% of the day in a general education setting. So that would be for her other classes that she's taking. So maybe an elective for PE, I think social studies would be on there, lunch, passing periods, things of that nature. We're also going to want to talk about other agencies that are involved with this particular student. So for this student, we see that they have regional center services, so that is marked. We're also going to discuss the promotion criteria for the student. What is it based on? Is it based off the district? Is it progress towards goals? Is it something else? This particular student has promotion criteria through the district. Parents will be informed of progress. So this is progress around the IEP. You have the right to be informed of your child's progress towards their goals. And it's typically based around report card time. That's typically the way I see it. So for this particular student, you would get progress around how they're going in terms of their goals every trimester. So 3 times yearly. And then you would receive this through a progress summary report. Sometimes it may be other things. I typically see it as a progress summary report where we see the goal, and then underneath they will talk about data that they've collected around that goal. So this is basically to make sure that we are working on the goal throughout the entire year and we know where student is. So it shouldn't be a surprise if we're getting to the end of our IEP year and we're not making a goal. So we should have a lot of progress to demonstrate whether or not we're going to meet that goal or not. So that's what this is really designed for here. And then finally, activities to support transition. So this would be like a transitionary year, like preschool to kinder, or maybe from a public school to a non-public school. For this particular student, we don't have any transitions expected at this time. And finally, we have the IEP notes page. So this, I've seen it in different places on the actual IEP document. In some districts, they do it at the very beginning, where they'll have the full discussion of what happened in the IEP, or more commonly, I see it at the end of an IEP. So basically, this should record the key points and key discussions we've had throughout that IEP conversation. It should include who was there, our decisions that we've made for students, any concerns, either teacher or parent or service provider, any follow-up items or items that we may need to put in a parking lot for a later date. So maybe we need to do an extra assessment or something to that effect. We could put that in our parking lot until we could meet again to discuss that assessment or data to be collected. And then we're also going to have that offer of FAPE. So what was the offer from the school? So again, for this particular student, we see her offer of FAPE. We have the specialized academic instruction, speech and language. They break it down. We have the ESY information as well. In the IEP process now, due to COVID, we do need to discuss any type of emergency circumstances. So if the school were to close for a certain amount of time, I believe it's 10 days or more, they have to discuss this section. Or I'm sorry, implement this section. This should be discussed every time. So how will all of these things, the offer of FAPE, be provided to the student? Say if we had to close our physical school doors, we still need to be able to educate the student. They still need to be able to work on their goals and receive their services. So this will outline how that will be implemented. And then a lot of the time at the bottom, they'll say, you know, parent is in agreement, or if parent isn't in agreement, they will mention that section there. For this particular notes page, not all notes pages look the same. Some may have a little less, some may have a little bit more. In terms of the note page, you do have the right to request certain things be added. Say we missed a certain conversation. We're all human, things get missed. Feel free to let them know, hey, we discussed such and such. Can we add this to the note section? Because we want to make sure we're documenting our full discussions for that IEP. Alrighty, and that concludes our IEP fundamentals and the IEP document. I see we had a couple of questions in the chat. And it looks like we have the slides as a PDF in the chat as well.
And then thank you, Herman, for, I didn't notice that, that we can email the PDF to people who registered for this particular training.
And did we have any questions regarding the fundamentals or applying the fundamentals or the IEP document itself?
I'll just go ahead and share since we have the benefit of our Spanish language translators in the alternate audio
Oh, great.
channel. We will have this PowerPoint presentation translated to Spanish. We don't have it yet, but given we had Spanish language participants with interest in the ability to review the content, we'll get this translated to Spanish and send it out to those participants as well.
Thank you, Herman. Oh, thank you, Amanda. I'm glad that this was helpful. And we do have our information here. I'm Christine Gamberg, and here's my email address. And then also Tara's email address is here. If there was a lot of information given today. So if you do have any questions after, please feel free to reach out, and we'd be happy to help any way we can. And then again, this PDF version of this presentation will be emailed to those who registered for this webinar.
And then we did have a question. Can you tell us which schools might be better for kiddos between gen ed class and a special day class? Unfortunately, we don't have many recommendations. Typically, when
We're
we
not
become
able to.
involved, yeah, when we become involved in an IEP process, it's typically because there's an issue. So I don't like to give too many recommendations, or any really. I'm also newer to this particular area in Northern California for the last year or so. So I would suggest, if we're not sure about setting, is just having the conversation with your IEP team, letting them know I have a concern, my student is in between general education and special day class. How can we create a program that will be appropriately challenging to my student where they're not going to reach a level of frustration where they may want to, like, say, give up, or we see behavioral escalations and things of that nature. There's a lot of options. We don't necessarily have to be in just general education or just a special day class. We can do combinations. So maybe like we saw with this particular student, our mock student here, they were in special day class for language arts, for math, and for science, but every other subject, they were in a general education setting. So it just may need to be a conversation with the IEP team on how we can have more inclusion time and, again, appropriately challenge them.
But in terms of making specific recommendations for schools, we're not at liberty to make those specific recommendations. If that's also a question you're asking, we can't make specific recommendations.
Can we get a Zoom replay? We are in the process. We have a couple of other workshops that we've done, and we have a few planned for the future as well. So we're still trying to find a centralized location for everybody to be able to access the Zoom recordings. Are IEPs available in the parent's preferred language? If so, can they request for one?
Yes. They, at the IEP, of course, it takes some time to have them translated, but you do have a right to have a copy of your IEP in your native language. So at the IEP, I would suggest just requesting that the IEP document, once it's available, is translated. You may be given the English copy first because it does take some time. They do need to send that out to be translated, but you can request your procedural safeguards as well as the IEP document in your native language.
And for transition to adult age students within the ITP, do you discuss supported decision making along with conservatorship? So this should be discussed. So again, we have that power of attorney as well. Again, we start this ITP process at age 16, where parent still has the right to make all the decisions for student in consenting to the IEP, the services, all of that stuff. So it should be a conversation once we get to that ITP. So again, there is that section for conservatorship. And if we're not doing conservatorship, we could discuss power of attorney for educational decision making. There's different categories that you can do the power of attorney for. But it would be important to have that prior to the student's 18th birthday.
Any other questions? Of course. Okay, if there's no other, thank you, everyone. We really appreciate you joining us this morning. And again, if you do have any additional questions that you can think of after this informational webinar ends, then please feel free to reach out via email to myself or Tara.
And then I also, oh, sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
I also put the actual slideshow in the chat as well. There's a link to it where you can view just in case the PDF version maybe cut off
Oh,
certain
thank you.
things. So that way, if you put it into present mode, because there's a lot of boxes and arrows and stuff that get in the way, if you put it into present mode, you should be able to see everything that we presented today.
And did you do that read only version?
View, yeah. View
Yeah, that's what I
only.
meant. I didn't mean read it. Thank you.
Yes,
only.
view only. Yes, I did.
Because all of a
Anyone
sudden
with the
we'll
link
see our
should be able to.
slideshow change.
Yeah, we want to keep it the same.
Okay.
Alrighty. If there's any other questions, again, feel free to type them in the chat. You have our emails as well. Feel free to reach out to us. We'd be happy to help direct you towards resources and answer any questions.